Well, last week I got people quite upset by complaining about Stellaris, and the vitriol was so intense this time around that I figured I'd give a little bit more clarification to the points I made and didn't explain well enough. The most common argument I saw comes down to stop min-maxing and just roleplay. For all intents and purposes, I think this is an entirely valid argument on the surface, and I acknowledged it in the original video several times. Let me explain what I mean when I say that I don't think Stellaris is a very good engine for enabling roleplay because of a lack of interaction. I apologize for not making this clearer originally. I didn't define very well what I meant when I said there's not very much interaction between empires that isn't, well, murder. So, when I say there's a lack of interaction, yes, obviously, there are other buttons you can click on the diplomacy screen that aren't declare war. Meaningful interactions, however, there really aren't. With one exception, haggling over vassalization is actually a really good mechanic. There's a lot to tweak and to change, and it gives you a lot of options. I would really like to see this level of depth applied to your policy management and your friendships with other empires. It's very true that there are diplomatic treaties you can enact with other empires, yes, but they barely count because they're about as impactful as a GAR landing. A research pact is not going to change how you play the game, and a migration treaty doesn't do much other than let you shove different people into colony ships. Joining a federation gives you percentage modifiers. The voting mechanic is neat, but I personally found it almost irrelevant, because if you're in a federation with others, they're almost certainly going to like you anyway, and thus agree with whatever you want. If you do find these mechanics and packs adequate enough for your roleplay, then great. Gameplay-wise, though, they're pretty dry, and add very little, at least in my experience. Being able to individually select my feelings towards others would be great. Like if you could pick what kind of friendships you wanted with other states, whether that be seeing them as like a buffer state, a genuine friend, enemy of my enemy, you get the idea. The current system of selecting policies from a drop-down whenever they become relevant to change feels so silly. Like, it seems like it's UI that isn't finished. Democracies have no parliaments to satisfy or people to please, they just instantly change policies at will. It's really confusing to me that a mechanic like Hoi 4's American Senate just doesn't exist for democracies. Not only because it, makes sense, but it'd help reinforce that totalitarian empires are significantly different. Fresh new addition to the script here, Galactic Paragons came out recently with a leader and government overhaul. Now, you might expect to have to appease your Council Crusader King style, or have an actual governmental body, but no, they actually changed nothing I mentioned throughout this entire section. They locked leader traits behind a $15 DLC. The stop min-maxing argument goes hand in hand with the why are you playing on an easier difficulty and then complaining about it being easy question I saw pop up a few times. I actually answered this in the original video. Let me play it for you. A higher difficulty doesn't really fix things because all it does is make the AI cheat really hard, which forces you to cheese, and then you end up in an XCOM 2 alpha striking difficulty feedback loop. To explain the XCOM thing very quickly, XCOM 2 made the player stronger, like really strong, and then they realized the only way they could make the game actually difficult is if enemies murked you instantly as soon as they got their actions, which forces the player to destroy them as fast as possible in an alpha strike every time. This is analogous to Stellaris in that if you play on a higher difficulty, it just forces you to cheese, min-max, and build the best ship design for the current patch. I was already doing this, so it doesn't change anything about how I was playing. The outcome is the same. Playing on Grand Admiral does not change anything about how I feel, because the minimal interactions you have with other empires does not change based on your difficulty. Sorry for not presenting my gamer card. Next up is just play multiplayer. This one really confused me, because Paradox game multiplayer is infamously desync prone and clunky. It runs like ass, hell, the base game does on its own past 50 years, and oftentimes feels like you're fighting the networking rather than players. I'm speaking from experience too. I have tried a few RP games in the past in both Stellaris and Hoi 4, and they were, to put it kindly, a nightmare. Endless reconnects, ungodly amounts of rules to follow, Discord mods, and no one ever showed up again past the first session. Yeah, if you do have a close group of friends to play with consistently, it'll be a good time, as will pretty much all media. Additionally, so little of the player base actually prefers multiplayer. If you look up any thread regarding the question of if people play single player or multiplayer, the responses are consistently and overwhelmingly solo AI, solo AI, solo AI, with the occasional co-op with a friend. If you do like the multiplayer, good on you, of course. but I can't help but feel like the Venn diagram of those who like roleplay does not often intersect with those who like 4Xs, a genre which is infamous for min-maxing. Hell, look at the name, and even past that, it is literally responsible for this quote. Also, I had people get confused by my point about civic variety. I said that there isn't enough variety, but there are civics which force you to play totally differently via disabling mechanics, so that's a contradiction, right? Well, no, because they're lacking a core part of the solution. If you're going to take away a mechanic, replace it with something else, like how driven assimilators work. With them, you're forced to alter pops that aren't yours, which basically everyone hates, but you do convert them into cyborgs. Fnatic Purifier's replacement for literally all their diplomatic options are percentage stat modifiers. There's no war council you have to appease, there's no managing savage tribes, no insatiable hunger you can only sate with blood. No, you just can't be diplomatic. This is what I meant when I talked about Stellaris lacking an asymmetrical gameplay. There are almost no mechanics which are unique to certain playstyles. Everyone has access to everything. You choose what you lock off from yourself and not what you get that everyone else does. There are the Ascension paths, which are cool the first few times, but once again, they're just stat changes. With the exception of the Shroud, which actually does give you a cool new mechanic, but literally every empire, bar robots, can do this. This can be interpreted as a good thing, as can the game handing you the keys to make your own empires, but I found they only contributed to the sameness that I mentioned in the original video. Like I've said before though, if you actually like this aspect, good on ya. I just much prefer the in-depth asymmetrical balancing like what's in something like Warhammer 3, Sins, or many other 4Xs. To cover how I feel about the roleplay point a little bit more, I get what people are trying to say. Stop trying to win every game, and you'll find some variety in the process. This is inherently subjective because people will enjoy media in their own way, but for me personally, unfortunately, here's what happens if I don't try to win. There isn't a lot of things to do outside of war. There's empire management and the stories from Anomalies, you know, the mystery of what's out there. After my first 3 games, this never intrigued me again. You'll see the same events repeated, first contacts galore, and then the illusion really falls apart, at least it did for me. If you find these consistently engaging and can really get lost in it, then more power to you. I think Stellaris' lack of victory variety really hurts it, maybe more than any other point so far. The only real way to have the victory screen pop up is to conquer the entire galaxy, which, yes, you can do diplomatically by having a lot of fleet power, but it's still the same thing. Civ has like 6 different victory conditions, which gives a lot of playstyle variety oriented around all the different resources, and domination isn't the only choice every game. Effectively, it incentivizes doing something other than just making ship after ship. Stellaris also has no variety in cost. For a good example of what this means, and an example of it done well, Company of Heroes balances factions around 3 main resources: manpower, munitions, and fuel. Some factions have high manpower cost, others rely more on the latter two. They all get the same type of vehicles at the end of the day, but changing up their costs warps how you have to play and which resources you covet, which is good. There is nothing like this in Stellaris, aside from pops taking different resources as upkeep via certain traits. To give an example of what I'd like to see, maybe a giant chapel which you only get from being spiritualist, which costs an enormous amount of artifacts. A Mad Max empire who uses consumer goods as trash guns. Or a wholly organic empire which has massively increased food cost for everything in lieu of other materials. Expanded Gestalt even has this, and it's great fun to be presented with such a dramatic change in gameplay. This next point might very well not align with your personal beliefs because it gets into the ever nebulous why do we play video games territory, but you can say stop playing to win, but that is why I am here. If I wanted to experience or write a story, I would go to media or other genres, which are way better suited for that. A book for written story, a TTRPG for making one, and I don't know, a genre which doesn't have exploit in the name. The mechanics of a video game are there for you to use to win, especially in this genre. I don't personally find handicapping myself to make the game playable very enjoyable. I can't think of another game where I feel like I have to not try for the game to be enjoyable at a base level. There are plenty of games which work very well as story generators without playing literally identically without any effort from the player. Battle Brothers is a great example. The randomness of recruits, purchasables, contracts, encounters, and even level leveling up ends up producing a very different asymmetrical experience where your playstyle has to adapt to the cards that you're dealt. But in Stellaris, your game plan is very much set from the start. For the sake of fairness, I think it's important to mention that it is malleable via factions and editing civics, but there's no reason to do this aside from roleplay. Aside from the additional civic point you can get via research, the options it opens up to you are always available in Empire management, and so there's no real reason to embrace different factions, at least not that I know of. It is equivalent to like a respec, so it is absolutely a net positive to have in the game. I just think the game draws far too much attention to what is ultimately a very irrelevant mechanic most of the time. And yes, there might be some extremely niche strategy which relies upon using these mechanics, but almost every conventional run, I don't think you will ever touch it. Is Stellaris not for me? Well, sure, but I also don't think that should make the game immune to criticism. For me, at the very least. Unless you go out of your way to try and make Stellaris runs unique, then they won't be. You will encounter the same empires with the same lines of dialogue, with the portraits swapped out and minimal changes between them. I can't really say that I have to go out of my way to make XCOM runs, Total War runs, or other story generators memorable. Maybe that's because I'm biased, or maybe it's because they actually have mechanical variety. Okay, last lightning round mentions. The space UN is pointless because most of the resolutions are good for every empire in the universe, meaning there's no reason for anyone to say no. Locking a trait behind a portrait is arbitrary bullshit, because who's to say this guy doesn't grow, or that this guy can't eat rocks? They're wholly aesthetic choices, why are they limiting? Now I have to acknowledge the mods that I played with. The entire point of the last video, and this video, is that I want more asymmetrical gameplay in Stellaris. Expanded Gestalts was the only really significant gameplay changing mod that I ran aside from NSC2, which itself I really only use because I wanted Star Wars ships, and Expanded Gestalts gave me exactly what I wanted. Civics which entirely altered how the game played by adding new mechanics and changing how I spent resources. These didn't detract from any of my points on difficulty. If anything, it gave me exactly what I was looking for. If you want to think of it as an OP mod, sure, go wild, I guess. But I'm not going to play Paradox games unmodded. Ever. These games, much like Bethesda games, I find to be far too half-baked, and community editions help spice it up. Even if you dissect them in a college thesis with a magnifying glass to prove that they're unbalanced, I don't care. They make it more fun for me, so I'm going to play with them. And last up is the surprising amount of people who acted like Paradox's DLC policy is some sort of, like, physical law of the universe we all just have to accept and abide by now. No, locking updates to your game behind $20 every few months is indeed, like, extremely morally bankrupt, and I will find methods to circumvent it, like the optic fiber method mentioned previously. I can also recommend stealing a USB drive with the DLC installed off of random homeless people. Thanks to my patrons, you're all quite wonderful people. Love you all, and good night.